Scars Above is a sci-fi action-adventure shooter game with horror elements in it. You play as Lara Croft in space, or I mean Dr. Kate Ward, who's an engineer and scientist with a PhD in biology and mechanical engineering, and is part of the Scars team, which is a response team created by Earth to investigate the Metahedron, a colossal alien structure that mysteriously showed up next to the planet. In typical fashion, the investigation goes wrong and you end up dazed and waking up in this alien exoplanet with a ton of deadly monsters, various ecosystems, and plant life. Since you're both an engineer and scientist, you explore the world around you, taking samples of plant life, analyzing the monsters, and creating new weapons that you use in your pursuit to understand the mystery and survive. Thank you to the developers of Madhead Games for providing me a review code of the game. This video is not sponsored and I didn't have to get approval to post this. This review isn't going to have any of the major story spoilers and will include some of the earlier chapters as well as info from the trailers. I did beat the game in its entirety before making this review. Starting off with the highlights is the difficulty, and this game is quite challenging in a good way. Definitely not Elden Ring or Souls-like, but it does have some Souls-like elements such as respawn and save points being only available a handful of times throughout the level, and your health not recovering aside from using consumables. Using a save point does reset the enemies similar to other Souls-like games, and this goes right into the horror elements, which means that the enemies already look vicious and grotesque, but they also spawn at random locations when you're exploring. So as you're exploring the environment or trying to advance to your next objective, monsters surprise spawn like jump scares, keeping you on your toes at all times. The enemies themselves are also pretty challenging, with some of the enemies having specific weak points and others having some resistances. There's a good amount of variety of enemies, and the enemy design is pretty good. The first time you fight an enemy, it will be new and you might struggle a little bit, but then you get acclimated to the main moves and attacks, and then the game naturally throws more difficult enemies at you or more of them at you. Speaking of difficulty in enemies, the next natural progression has to be boss designs. The bosses do take it a step up in terms of difficulty. Most of the bosses have these glowing weak points which correspond to how you need to take them down, but usually it's a step above that, requiring some sort of strategy as well, since those weak points are usually covered or require precise timing to hit. It seems easy when you just watch a video, but because of the gameplay mechanics, which we will go into, it does get a bit challenging. One example of a unique boss design that we can talk about, since this was in the trailer, was a boss that has multiple phases. First, you have to shoot the weak points across the body, which temporarily stuns the boss, and you have a small window to shoot its internal weak point that gets exposed. After that, the boss enters a new phase where it corrupts the water so that you can't stand on the water anymore, otherwise you'll take enormous damage. You have to create ice platforms over the water to stand on using your gun, while also balancing your stamina, dodging attacks which break the ice platforms, and of course damage you, all while still trying to take down the boss by shooting its weak points. That fight was very memorable and really a good example of great boss design where you're juggling various things while still trying to take down the boss. Now let's move on to the gameplay, and this is another highlight of the game. We already talked about the enemies and bosses keeping you on the defensive at all times, but let's talk about weapons. You have a physical melee attack, but for a majority of the game you'll utilize ranged weapons. You have 4 weapon slots, each with their own element, and you can easily switch through these weapons, and that's where the game gets interesting, because now you can use one weapon with a specific element and then quickly switch to another one for some bonus damage, or you might need to because of how the enemies are designed. Shooting the weapon feels natural, and some of the weapons have a charge up sequence before releasing a shot, and that ties into the difficulty portion earlier. Those boss weak points that we were talking about are color coded, requiring a specific element to break each one, so you will be regularly switching weapons, and managing ammo becomes extremely important as well, since it may be next to impossible to beat certain monsters without a specific element. Then you also get abilities that Kate unlocks by exploring the different environments, and these can be a make or break in terms of taking down difficult enemies. The abilities are quite varied, and there's a regular cadence of unlocking them, keeping the gameplay fresh and unique with varied monster types. You can also level up your skills using 2 skill trees, one focused on survivability and one focused on offensive ability. It's tough balancing them since the enemies are sometimes meaty, but Kate also does not have a lot of health, so it is fun building your abilities and taking down tougher foes. In addition to skills, you also gain new abilities, and those help freshen the gameplay and take down tougher enemies as well. The way you build your skills is by increasing your knowledge, which gives you ability points. You can increase your knowledge by scanning new plant life, new monsters the first time you fight them, and mainly through finding these knowledge orbs, which give you knowledge XP. The game does a good job of placing these knowledge orbs around the map, so it forces you to explore an otherwise linear game. It gets pretty easy to find, where you'll sometimes be on 2 different paths, and you'll know that there's some loot or knowledge orb if you take the longer path to explore. One major plus for the game is the performance, where I didn't encounter any major issues during my entire playthrough. There was only one time where an objective didn't work for me, but it's because I didn't do the action beforehand and had to go back, initially do an inspection, and then it worked. In this day and age where games are launched with a ton of bugs, this was a breath of fresh air. Another major plus is the price, which is starting at $40, as opposed to the $60 or $70 games that have become the standard. With no microtransactions, since this is a completely story-driven game. This was also impressive to see. Now let's go to the stuff in the game that's just okay, and that's the story. I'm not going into the specifics here, but the story did feel a little too cookie cutter for me. It wasn't a bad story by any measure, but it also wasn't an amazing story. It seemed like it took the beaten path with a typical sci-fi story, and it seemed very predictable, and you know what you're getting into as soon as you finish the opening sequence. It flows pretty decently though, and has natural progression, and there are moments where you can't do anything except just live through a cutscene, but they feel natural to the story, and the positives are that the story isn't overly long or complex, but it is predictable. Another thing that's mainly specific to the genre is the jump scares from the monsters. That's a critical part of the game, so if you aren't into that, then just keep that in mind, but it is part of the genre, so I wanted to call that out in case that's a deal breaker. The environmental hazards are pretty cool, but I wish there was more of them and different types. There's only a handful of environmental hazards, and even though they are super useful, the game could have incorporated some smaller versions of them and incorporated more of them. Finally, let's go to the bad, and ultimately that's graphics. Now, I can't be too harsh here because I know that this is a cross-gen title and that this isn't a AAA game. It's made by a small studio with under 200 employees, so in all fairness, it's not terrible, but if someone were to come to me and ask what year this game got released, I definitely wouldn't have guessed that it got released in 2023. At times, the environments look really cool and immersive, but the weakest point are definitely the face models and character models, especially in the cutscenes. When actually playing the game, you don't notice it as much, and the game still plays well at 4K, and I was playing on ultra settings, but the textures were just not as HD as I would have wanted, or that may be a design choice to keep performance on previous gen consoles. Another negative is the camera angle and some of the controls. When doing investigations and interacting with objects, the camera doesn't allow you to use your right stick to look around. You can only use your left stick to move horizontally and vertically. It's a good thing that they bound the camera so you know what to focus on, but it feels really janky to not use your right stick to look around. It's probably something to do with that camera bounding, where they want to make sure you're viewing the object in a precise way so you can click on it, but it does feel very strange. I played this game using a controller on Steam, and it says partial controller support, so that may be the reason. Other than that though, the controls seem a tad off, and that's part of the game design to make this game more difficult. The slight delays, and sometimes it looks like my shots should connect, but they don't. And this only happened very occasionally, and I chalked that up to being game designed to make this game more challenging, or me just missing. But it's worth mentioning since sometimes it gets frustrating where you're sure you're hitting the weak point and it doesn't register. Now, since we covered everything, let's get to the verdict of this game. I rate games on a scale of play, backlog, and not worth it. And if you're a fan of sci-fi shooter horrors, then this game is a play. With all things considered, even with its average story and mediocre graphics, the gameplay elements in this game are ultimately fun, especially taking down tougher enemies and exploring everything this game has. When you combine this with the fact that the game launched without any major bugs, and especially when you consider that this game is at a lower price point and has a shorter time commitment, around 7 hours to complete the whole game on the average difficulty, it can still be a good pickup. If you're not a fan of the genre, then this game's unlikely to please you, and for the average gamer that doesn't like these type of games, this is definitely a backlog game. So you can explore it if it's a good deal, but nothing major to miss out on. If this review was helpful, then please like and subscribe so I can get monetized on YouTube and make more game reviews. Let me know what you like or dislike about this game in the comments, and I'll catch you next time.